Telepathy. Is there really such a thing? Is it actually possible to access a thought in another person's mind directly? Many people say it's happened to them, and you may have experienced something like that yourself. Others say it's pure imagination because it's impossible. It just can't happen. Probably most of us are in the middle. If we think about it at all, we don't really know what to think or who to believe. It's complicated. So in this video, I'm going to break down the arguments on both sides, and if you haven't already made up your mind, perhaps this will help. Hello, my name's Robert. I'm a journalist and author with an interest in these sorts of anomalous experiences that are often called psychic. A lot of research has been done in this area, and it's something I've been studying and writing about for some 30 years. And how I would have loved it if all that time ago I'd been able to click on a video and have someone explain it to me in around 15 minutes, as I'm going to try to do now. But in those days, the internet was hardly a thing, so I went to libraries. I read all the books and the science journals, all the commentary and the critiques by skeptics. And most recently, I've been helping to create an encyclopedia, which now has hundreds of articles written by scientists and investigators all around the world. It's a great way to get to know about these things, and if you'd like to check it out, I'll leave a link in the description below. Okay, so there are 3 steps. First, I'll make the case for telepathy, listing reasons to think it happens. Then in step 2, I'll act as advocate for the skeptic perspective, critiquing those arguments and coming up with new ones for thinking it probably doesn't. In step 3, I'll switch back again to see how well those objections stand up. Now, I think with this sort of thing, people tend to go with what they're comfortable with, so you could go in either direction. I have a view, of course I do. I couldn't still be on the fence after all this time, and at the end I'll tell you about it. You may or may not agree with me, and that's fine. The point of this video isn't to convince you I'm right. It's to try to give the arguments as fairly as I can. And if you watch to the end, you'll be better able to decide where you stand. And by the way, if you find this helpful, do please click like and subscribe. It really helps. So, step 1, reasons for thinking telepathy actually happens. I'm going to focus on 3 in particular. The first is that people do seem to experience it. Okay, it's rare. For most of us, it probably never happens. But some people describe having had odd interactions, usually with someone close to them. I mean, emotionally, not literally. That person could be some distance away. Parent and child, siblings, especially twins, couples in a relationship. For instance, a man suddenly feels an intense pain in his chest for no reason. He's perfectly healthy and it doesn't last long. And he later discovers that at that exact time his brother, who lives in another city, was hospitalized with a heart attack. Mothers of autistic children sometimes suspect a telepathic connection, as the child somehow always seems to know where things are hidden or what's planned for the evening meal, without the parent having given the slightest indication. You hear it happening with animals. Some pet owners are convinced their dog or cat can sense plans for a trip to the vet, again without giving any obvious clues. Lots of people have had these sorts of experiences, which we know because researchers have taken the trouble to ask. The first big surveys were done in the late 1800s, and they suggested that these aren't just coincidences, as we might naturally think, but a particular category of experience, not misunderstandings, not illusions, something real and perplexing. But of course the researchers wanted to test it, so they looked for people who seemed to have a particular gift for it, doing tests of various kinds. To start with, these were quite informal, trying to get the person to guess what they were thinking, a letter or a word or a number. Or they'd draw something while the person was in another room and try to get them to draw the exact same thing. And these tests were often surprisingly successful. But rather few scientists were convinced. So around the 1930s, they started doing more formal tests, like card guessing, with cards showing symbols that allowed them to make statistical calculations. And some people did score far more than you'd expect to happen by chance. A more typical experiment these days involves one person watching a short, engaging film clip and then trying to telepathically send the content to a person in a separate room. And again, this seems often to work. So on the face of it, there's actual evidence. People experience it, they've demonstrated in tests, and it's been artificially generated in controlled conditions. All right, so now let's go to step 2 and look at the counter-arguments, and here I'm going to talk as a skeptic with a contrary view. Personal experiences, well, yes, but first-person testimony is notoriously unreliable. Psychologists tell us that we're fallible in matters of this kind. Our brains evolved to help the first humans stay alive. They aren't necessarily optimum in making critical judgments in the modern world. So, for instance, we're quick to see patterns because these might alert us to useful food sources, or conversely, the presence of predators. A combination of rustling leaves, a change in the light, a certain scent. But this facility might also make us find connections that we think are significant when actually they aren't. Another thing is we underestimate the frequency of pure coincidence. We note things that match up, that seem meaningful to us, but forget the many more that aren't. An effect of selective memory and confirmation bias. So in short, we shouldn't pay too much attention to anecdotes. We need proper scientific evidence. True, that might seem to come from people who supposedly have psychic ability. But there's an unfortunate history here. When researchers first started working with psychics and mediums, there was a lot of fraud. People were caught doing tricks, or even later owned up to having done so. As we know, mentalist performances by stage magicians can be very convincing. And even if there's no conscious deception, it's easy to be misled by appearances. You can gain knowledge about someone or something from body language, expressions, or subtle clues in the environment. Now about the laboratory experiments, there's a big question mark here too. How can we be sure that a person who successfully guessed what someone else was thinking wasn't getting the information in some normal way? Critics of these experiments have often found flaws in the way that they're set up that might influence the result. Another problem is that successful experiments very often can't be replicated. And that lack of consistency is a big red flag. So those are counter-arguments, but there are two more problems, and they're big. One is this. Given what we now know about how the world works, and we know a lot, there's no way telepathy could happen, no conceivable mechanism. Think about it. In science, when we talk about the mind, we're really talking about the brain, because that's what science says the mind actually is, the physical and chemical stuff going on in our skulls. And here we seem to be saying that one person's brain can somehow get into contact with the brain of another person, not just in the same room, but miles away. That would mean the brain beaming out some sort of information waves and also receiving incoming information from another brain. But the brain just isn't like a wireless transmitter or receiver. If it beamed out energy, we'd know. And it absolutely doesn't. So if we're ever going to accept that telepathy happens, it would mean having to change our fundamental ideas about how the world works. And the evidence for such a historic shift just isn't there. And here's the other thing. Is telepathy even something we would want to happen? How would we feel if we knew our minds were open for some people to read at will? What kind of world would that be? How could society even function? As it happens, we're not in that world. Our thoughts are private to ourselves, and we should be thankful for it. Okay, so there I was acting as advocate for the prosecution, so to speak. And now in step 3, I'm going to switch hats again and consider these objections from the point of view of the defense. How serious are they really? About personal experience, yes, it's true. It's anecdotal and not objective. It needs to be confirmed by experiments. It's also true that humans are fallible in all sorts of ways. Academic psychologists have loads of studies that prove that. Thing is, though, you can talk about that in general terms, but it's rather hard to apply to reports of actual experiences, which stand out precisely because there doesn't seem to be any conventional explanation. If it's never happened to you, it's easy to dismiss an effect of psychological quirks, but that hasn't really been demonstrated. And if you think that most people are uncritical about their own experiences, or that they rush to supernatural conclusions, that's not obvious either. These sorts of things also happen to people who consider themselves to be skeptics. And of course they look for normal explanations. They just don't find any. And that's the whole point. Now about dishonesty. In the early years of research, in the late 1800s, there was a lot of fraudulent activity, probably because there was so much interest in these things at that time. Of course, unscrupulous types exploited it, and that still happens. You hear of fake psychics bilking gullible customers for huge sums. But where successful investigations are concerned, claims of fraud are usually just that, claims, allegations, speculation about how the effects might have been done by trickery. Researchers have spent years, decades sometimes, investigating a single individual, and these are long-term relationships with trusted collaborators. It's one thing to trick people with conjuring in a single encounter, or perhaps even 2 or 3. But the idea that researchers can be consistently deceived by the same individual, week in, week out, for months and years, well, that's a stretch. And what's their motivation? What's the point? It's the same with experiments. The claim is that if the methodology turned out to be flawed in some way, the findings can't be trusted. But the people who do these experiments, and these are for the most part actual scientists, working in laboratories, in universities and research institutes, they push back. They say that many of these flaws that the critics are so keen to find are often trivial and would often have had no effect on the end result. So could they really give rise to the illusion of telepathy? Or is the emphasis on flaws again just speculation, an excuse for rejecting findings that skeptics find hard to swallow? And it's true that successful experiments often can't be replicated, at least not consistently, and that bothers the researchers too. But the fact that scientists can't demonstrate telepathy every time they try doesn't have to mean it doesn't exist. It could just mean that it's a very unstable and sporadic phenomenon, hard to pin down, as in fact all the evidence suggests is the case. Now, as for being impossible, that does seem to be a big problem. If you think that consciousness is something that's created by the brain and that there's no such thing as minds, then you'll probably never be able to accept the idea of telepathy. Is that really the case, though? Certainly appears that way, but appearances can be deceptive, as scientists know better than anyone, at least in theory. And there is another way of thinking about consciousness, which these days is starting to attract more attention, which is that it's non-local, that's to say, not locally produced by each individual brain, but out there, everywhere, a fundamental part of nature that the brain connects with in some way. Even some people in mainstream science are starting to think this because of the difficulty of explaining how brains produce consciousness. And if that's truly the case, it means that what we call mind doesn't, after all, depend on the brain. It's an independent entity. And although we'd still have absolutely no idea how it happens, there's less reason to suppose that this mind can't interact with other minds. So where do I stand on all of this? I actually share some of the general objections. It's one thing if we as individuals believe that telepathy happens, perhaps along with other types of psychic experiences equally controversial. But the critics are right. For science to accept them would mark an extraordinary shift in Western society and culture, with who knows what consequences. I can also understand the fear that some people might have access to our thoughts and intentions. It can be scary. I just don't think that these sorts of concerns can be used as a reason for doubting the existence of this rather large category of human experience. I side with researchers who believe telepathy is real, partly because of certain experiences of my own, which I can only explain by supposing that consciousness is non-local, but also because I respect their work. It's large-scale, very varied, and carried out with extreme seriousness. Of course, they sometimes make mistakes and missteps, which the critics are right to expose. But there are complex issues here, and I just don't think that's the whole story. You can insist telepathy doesn't happen because you think the claims are weak, or because we don't live in that sort of world, or for whatever reason. I just find it hard to believe that whenever someone has an experience that seems telepathic, that person is succumbing to some kind of error or illusion every time, or that every demonstration is bogus, or that every successful experiment is somehow flawed. When people talk like this, it doesn't look to me like objective criticism. It looks like resistance. I don't think you can reasonably say that telepathy has never been demonstrated. Arguably, demonstrations have been documented hundreds, possibly thousands of times, in all sorts of ways. What is perhaps true is that these demonstrations haven't been of a type or a strength or a consistency to persuade the science community to dump centuries of thinking and assumptions. So my position is simply this. Yes, telepathy does happen, but at this particular moment in history, at this stage of the development of our thinking, we're just not ready to come to terms with it. These are things I'll be exploring in future videos, and I hope you'll join me. In the meantime, if you'd like to know more about the issues around consciousness, I made a video that goes into more detail about it, and I've also made a video looking at telepathy in children with disabilities. I'll leave the links in the description below, and thanks for watching.